Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 10th, 2023. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I hope you had a great Independence Day week. I took a few days off of doing the show, tried to get caught up on some other work here at TAC, but today I want to get right back to it. And I'm going to share with you, I guess, what we can call kind of a mid-season or a mid-year state of the nullification movement update. I've got reports on 10 to 12 bills that we've been tracking, most of which are now in effect as law or going in effect this summer on things like central bank digital currency, surveillance, health freedom, the right to keep and bear arms, maybe a little bit more. I forget everything that I put in my notes last night, but I want to get right to it, talking briefly about some of the strategy that we follow from the founders and old revolutionaries. Here's Roger Sherman saying that all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. If an act goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, as James Otis Jr. put it in 1761 in his speech against the writs of assistance, referring to even the unwritten British Constitution, an act against the Constitution is void. This is one of the foundational principles of the American Revolution. Government is only authorized to do the stuff that the people have determined that government is supposed to do. That's how it's supposed to be, despite the fact that we live under the largest government in history. But Sherman reiterates that essential point, that all acts of Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. So he's pointing out that, well, there could be some kind of conflict. And just because the states think something is unconstitutional, not warranted by the Constitution, and they tell the feds that's the case, that doesn't mean the feds are just going to stop. Just saying, hey, this is unconstitutional, waving words on paper at people with power doesn't stop them. Sherman recognizes all this in just this two short sentences in this short statement, that the government would still try to enforce it even though they don't have constitutional authority. But if a majority of the states say, well, we're not participating in it, then they wouldn't be able to pull that off. And James Madison went into some more detail on that in Federalist number 46 a few weeks after this, where Sherman was writing this. And I'm just going to cite the one key phrase. I've covered this in many episodes, and I will link to an episode on Madison's strategy in the show notes. But he said, when states and individuals use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, it creates an environment which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And that's in the words of the father of the Constitution, recognizing that a refusal to participate in enforcement of federal acts or regulatory programs, whatever you want to call them today, they would not be able to get them enforced. Or even Alexander Hamilton, of all people. He put it this way, talking about the Supremacy Clause and the acts that the federal government is authorized to exercise, similar to what Sherman had to say. But he adds a little punch at the end that I think is really important. And I'm no fan. My Twitter account says, @MichaelBolden, says, he, him, Hamilton hater is my... That's what I listed on there for fun. But here's how Hamilton put it. Acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation. A usurpation is theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states. When the government exercises powers not delegated to it, it's an act of usurpation. And he said these are acts of usurpation, so they're void, right? And he said they deserve to be treated as such. So if government is doing stuff that is a usurpation, a theft of power, what St. George Tucker later called treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people, are you treating it as an act of usurpation if you ask the people doing the usurpation to stop doing what they shouldn't have been doing in the first place? No. They deserve to be treated as such. And we follow Madison's advice pretty aggressively here, using states, pushing for states and individuals and localities to use this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. With that just kind of foundation, here's some of the bills that went into effect as law just recently. I've got a few others to mention as well. First of all, in Indiana, Senate Bill 468 went into effect as law on July 1st. The law makes a number of changes. This is a report by Mike Meharry. The law makes a number of changes to Indiana's Uniform Commercial Code, including explicitly excluding a central bank digital currency from the definition of money in Indiana, effectively banning its use as such in the state. This is a preemptive move because we know they're pushing us in this direction, and the more that the states put up roadblocks for them to be able to roll it out easy peasy, the more likely we'll have a chance to stop it. Because if it's really just about asking the Federal Reserve, please don't do this to us, or asking Congress, please don't expand their power, or the executive branch, this will never stop them. The only way to stop them is through opting out, through creating roadblocks, through nullification, through resistance, through a refusal to comply. Here again from Meharry's report, the law amends the definition of money to specify, quote, the term does not include a central bank digital currency that is currently adopted or that may be adopted by the United States government, a foreign reserve, or a foreign sanctioned central bank. I'm not sure about all the details on that, but a similar law went into effect in Florida on July 1st. I know most everybody talking about states versus a central bank digital currency have focused on Florida, but Florida was actually second to pass this into law. First was Indiana. Now, of course, supporters of the monster state want us all to believe this is just some partisan hackery. It's just Team Red going after Team Blue or vice versa. This is just a kind of electioneering garbage. But if you look at the vote passed on Senate Bill 7054 in Florida, it passed by a vote of 116-1 in the House and by a 34-5 vote in the Senate. It went into effect on July 1st. And in Indiana, it's the same kind of message. In the House, it was 95-2 and 46-0. If you want to call that partisan hackery, that's cool, but it is the entirety, left, right, and center of both of these state legislatures saying, no, we don't want to include a central bank digital currency as money under our Uniform Commercial Code here in the state of Indiana and Florida. Of course, I covered this in some detail just a couple of months ago. James Madison's strategy versus a central bank digital currency, talking about these various state-level efforts and Madison's entire four-step program to stop federal programs, or four-step strategy to stop federal programs without relying on the federal government to magically do something it never does, which is stop itself. Applying that to a central bank digital currency, I will link to that in the show notes as well. Now, talking about money, this is one that actually went into when is this one going into effect? I think it's actually going into effect at the end of the month, but it's a good time to mention it. In Arkansas, they passed a gold and silver legal tender act as well. Because if you're just talking about dealing with a central bank digital currency, the solution isn't to support the fiat money system, which they've been using to fund all of their unconstitutional programs. The fiat funding money is not freedom. That is a tool of control. The central bank digital currency is just the next logical step of how they expand power. If you think about, think about a cell phone. What else can they do to make your cell phone more advanced technologically? Well, they sometimes come up with gimmicks like a foldable. They keep wanting to add more to it. And the same thing goes for government power. What do they want to do with the tool that funds the largest government in history? That is the fiat money system, the Federal Reserve. Well, they want to turn it into a tool of surveillance and total control. That's the central bank digital currency. So supporting the foundation for a central bank digital currency is not the way to stop it. Of course, you have to reject it as money, not use it. That's more important than what the states are doing, is the people choosing to not use it. But also the states can take action to encourage people to actually use real money, gold and silver, sound money. Here in Arkansas, House Bill 1718, I believe, goes into effect on July 31st. I'm not sure of the date. We can look into this later. The new law makes gold and silver specie legal tender in the state, meaning it is recognized as a medium of exchange. Practically speaking, Meharry writes, this will allow Arkansans, I didn't know that that's what they refer to themselves as, that's cool, to use gold or silver coins as money rather than just as mere investment vehicles, or things like the gold back. Next up, we're talking about surveillance. In Montana, the governor, just at the end of June, signed Senate Bill 397 into law to address facial recognition surveillance. And here from our report, it includes an outright ban, and it went into effect immediately. I think it was on June 29th. It includes an outright ban on continuous facial surveillance, which is defined as, quote, the monitoring of public places or third-party image sets using facial recognition technology or for facial identification to match faces with a pre-populated list of face images. So no just continuous surveillance of an area with facial recognition. The term includes, but is not limited to scanning stored video footage to identify faces in the stored data, real-time scanning of video surveillance to identify faces passing by cameras, and passively monitoring video footage using facial recognition technology for general surveillance purposes without a particularized suspicion of a specific target. So this is kind of getting back to some root norms of how the system is supposed to be. In Montana, Senate Bill 397 went into law just at the end of last month. Now, a similar thing is happening here in California, of all things. It's not final and to the governor yet, and we're not sure what that guy will do with it, but might as well at least cover it, because if something positive is happening in the California Assembly, which is very rare, we got to at least push it forward as much as we can. On January 1st, 2020, there was a law that went into effect prohibiting law enforcement agencies or law enforcement officials from, quote, installing, activating, or using any biometric surveillance system in connection with an officer camera or data collected by an officer camera. This includes both body-worn and handheld devices. It was scheduled to sunset on January 21st, 2023. It might actually be sunsetted at this point. I'm not sure if there was a temporary extension somewhere. But there's this new bill that's that already passed out of the Assembly, and it's moving forward in the state Senate. They should have a final vote on that maybe in the next week or so. AB 1034, it reenacts the law and keeps it into effect until 2027. I don't know why. Well, there's an aggressive lobby against trying to restrict any type of mass warrantless surveillance anywhere. So the fact that they're able to get a couple of years and the chip away. Now, interestingly enough, I was surprised to see the impact that this temporary pause on facial recognition had just a couple of years ago. It had a major impact, Mike Meharry writes, even before it went into effect. In December 2019, San Diego announced it would shut down one of the largest, I think it was at the time, the largest facial recognition program in the country to comply with the current law. So they're working on expanding that here in California, of all places. And in Utah, a couple months ago, and I don't know if I've covered this in another episode, but since I'm talking about surveillance and laws that are going into effect right now, I should mention this legislation in Utah, House Bill 57, which passed unanimously both in the House and the Senate, 70-0 in the House, 26-0 in the Senate. It requires police to get a warrant before obtaining reverse location information for electronic devices within a geofence or by using cell site records. What they do, instead of having a warrant based upon probable cause, particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized, they just do a general warrant, and they say, well, if you happen to be in this we draw a little area on our digital map, and if you happen to be in that area, we can track who is there, what your communications are, where you're going. They use this in, I believe, Santa Clara or San Jose, in Northern California during the lockdowns to kind of track who was going to churches when they weren't allowed to. I think they just lost a state lawsuit on that. The government lost a state lawsuit on that saying you can't do this. So to see restrictions on geofence surveillance are very important before the next so-called emergency tries to shut everybody down and tells people they can't leave. Because, of course, what they want to do is, even if they don't have facial recognition or a drone monitoring, they're going to monitor you where you are by your cell phone, and government could just show up and do stuff. Well, in effect, Mike writes, the passage of HB 57 in Utah limits this process called geofencing. It allows police to search broad geographical areas and identify every electronic device in the area. And I know everybody says, oh, just leave your phone at home. Well, it's not always the easiest thing to do. And these are all very small steps forward, but we have to recognize that we're not going to get from zero to liberty in a single step. Anyone selling you a silver bullet is a liar. They're a scammer. I prefer to go with Thomas Jefferson. In this great letter to Reverend Charles Clay in 1790, he reiterated a long-held strategy of he and many other founders and old revolutionaries that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. He said, we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. I'm going to link to all of these reports, the original source documents that I'm citing, etc. In the show notes. I publish a blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. So you'll be able to find that there. And you can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream video ones, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, LinkedIn. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I appreciate everybody who's been following us there. But we're on a bunch of other platforms like Gab and Minds that we archive the videos. Sovereign.com has been really great to us. And we have the audio-only podcast edition there as well on all the major platforms and some of the minor ones. But each episode has, if you scroll down past all the the stuff about the episode and the video and the player and all that, you'll find a show links section where you can pick up the stuff that I'm talking about, because I'm just scratching the surface. While I'm here, I do want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you guys being here. There's Kirk Morrison, Senator DT. There is Dixie Strong, Alt Reality, Tim Martin, Sharon Patriot, King Nobody, Cheriton Farmer, Ward Lawrence, Joseph, White-Bearded Gnu, Richard Banks, who else? Disordered Bipolar is a fun screen name, Mr. Greenbottle, and everyone else. I know I'm scrolling through pretty fast here. I'm missing a few people. There's John and a few others. Thank you so much for being here. Again, whether this is your first episode or you've been here all along, I don't even think I've been here for every episode since day one, so thank you so much. But let's get right back to it. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about this new law in Florida, another one. I hate the term constitutional carry. It implies that you get, like, your Second Amendment is your gun permit. The Second Amendment, the Constitution, does not give you permission to keep and bear arms. You do. Your very existence as a human being. So I can't stand the phrase constitutional carry, but let's call it what it is, or what most people call it, just because that's what people recognize what it is. Basically, changing state law to remove restrictions for some people, at least, to be able to carry and possess and have a firearm, a tool of self-defense, without a specific permission slip and the taxes and all that stuff, the tracking that goes along with it. But a new law went into effect in Florida also on July 1st. This is the same date for all of them there. This is House Bill 543. It allows persons, there's some limitations on this. So even if you're saying constitutional carry, you're also taking the position that there are limits on your natural right to self-defense, where there really aren't. But it allows persons over 21 to legally carry a firearm without a permit in Florida. The state does maintain its concealed carry licensing process for those who wish to get a permit in order to carry in other states that maintain CCDW reciprocity with Florida. Residents will only need to have a valid ID on them while concealed carrying. Now, some people, of course, this is a step forward in Florida. Again, ground of liberty has been gained by inches. We've had many efforts in Florida to move this type of thing forward, and they've always been shot down. Finally, they got something on the board, and so we can actually cheer an improvement. But, of course, there's still more to do. For example, I already mentioned some kind of limitations and caveats there. But here from the report, some gun rights advocates say it isn't truly a, quote, constitutional carry law because it doesn't allow the open carrying of firearms, but that's something they can come back and work on in the future. So House Bill 543 in effect in Florida. In Texas, I think this went into effect immediately upon signing at the end of June, Senate Bill 773. There's been a Right to Try Act on the books in Texas since 2015. This is a law that allowed a certain narrow number of terminally ill patients the ability to try medications not given final approval by the FDA. In other words, the FDA was basically saying, well, you may be dying, but we're not going to allow you to do this. People that didn't qualify for their certain emergency use programs and things like that. And the state laws, a number of state laws, I think it was like 38 or 40, started saying, well, we're going to allow people to do this anyways. We don't care what the FDA happens to say. It's like, you're dying. Let the person have the choice. I mean, people should have a choice whether they're dying or not. I mean, we're all on the way towards death at some point. But under that law, Mike Meharry writes, terminally ill patients can access medications and treatments that do not have final FDA approval. Now, the enactment of this new one, Senate Bill 773, I should mention that after 30 or so states passed these, the federal government passed a very similar act. And now what we're seeing is states like Texas and also another one in Montana trying to push it a little further than what the feds are allowing. So we can see how these small steps push the feds, because they're like, if they're trying to stop 70 states from allowing people dying from doing something, they're going to look really bad. And they already look bad, but I think it makes them look bad to even the mainstream. So they back down a little bit on that. And now Texas is trying to push the ball a little bit further. And I think that's the way to do this strategically. So the enactment of this new law from Senator Tan Parker and signed by Abbott there, it expands the 2015 law to enable patients suffering from chronic disease. You don't just have to be on the way towards death, proving that you got like 6 months to live. Now, as long as you just have a chronic condition rather than only terminal, to access medications and treatments not yet given final approval for the use by the FDA. It is a small step towards pointing out that the FDA is potentially, well, maybe irrelevant. Maybe we just don't need them. Hint, hint, right? And if people aren't dying in the streets and they're saying, well, they are, but now that rejecting the FDA can allow some people to live longer lives or healthier lives, this is a very positive message, I think. The House passed that final version of that in Texas by a vote of 141-1. Again, this is not some partisan garbage. And the Senate approved it unanimously by a vote of 31-0. Now, the legislation also prohibits state officials from any actions that would prevent lawful administering of experimental procedures to eligible patients. So if the FDA starts saying to local law enforcement, or maybe the DOJ says, well, this is illegal according to federal law, we're going to work with you on some joint task force and you're going to shut this down. Well, the state law says you can't do that. So they're not going to participate in federal enforcement programs. It says an official, employee, or agent of this state may not block or attempt to block an eligible patient's access to an investigational drug, biological product, or device under this chapter, unless it's not within the law, I guess. This is important, Mike writes, since local law enforcement often works closely with federal agencies. They do on almost every issue. The National Governors Association back in 2013, during one of those many fake government shutdowns where they just close some parks and make things inconvenient for day-to-day life for some people, but they keep the surveillance state and the gun control state, and the military-industrial complex keeps chugging along. The Federal Reserve keeps printing. All the big stuff keeps going. But during that shutdown, the National Governors Association freaked out. They're saying, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. So if the feds shut down, then these programs that the feds are partnering with us on, which are federal programs, they're not going to work. But the converse is correct as well, and that's not a brand deal. It's also correct that when the states don't participate in federal enforcement, when partnerships break down, when half the team quits, the partnership doesn't work. And that's what Madison was getting at in Federalist 46 when he said a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. He said in a single state would make it difficult. In a large state, it would be a real problem. And if a bunch of states went together in doing this, it would make it nearly impossible for the feds to do anything about it. That's even more aggressive than how Roger Sherman explained it. So that's the Texas Right to Try Act. We're talking some health freedom things. Then also in Iowa, there's a new law that allows raw milk actually to be sold. Now, you may be wondering, how is this a nullification effort? And I'll explain that just briefly here in a moment. Under current law, and for many years, there's been efforts to legalize unpasteurized milk. I eat unpasteurized dairy products. It's the only kind I can eat. I don't know if we're going to talk health stuff here, but if I eat regular cheese or milk or anything like that, I get pretty ill pretty quickly. Sometimes it even takes a couple of days. But if I eat unpasteurized, so the theory is, at least for me, the pasteurization process kills off some of the healthy bacteria that my system needs to be able to process it, and I can go ahead and eat raw cow, raw goat, raw sheep milks, cheese, and things like that. So here in Iowa, anyways, that's a quick side note, personal stuff that you don't really need to know. The new law allows this went into effect on July 1st as well. It allows a raw milk producer to process, market, and distribute raw milk and raw milk products directly to a consumer from the dairy. So it's a small step forward. They can go right to the farmer, and which makes a lot of sense in a place like Iowa. And they can pick up these raw products. Before, that was something you could get arrested for. Now, the impact on a federal prohibition, not that the feds are trying to prohibit this right now, but they want to. And here from that report, not only do the feds ban the transfer, they do ban it across state lines. It is illegal. There was a group in the Northeast a number of years ago called the Raw Milk Raiders. They would buy raw milk in Pennsylvania, where it was legal on a state level, drive it to New Jersey, where it was illegal on a state level because they couldn't get it locally, and it would take it across state lines, which is illegal according to the feds. These are all acts of nullification by this group of people, the Raw Milk Raiders. And then they would go in front of a federal building and drink raw milk with signs that said, "I drink raw milk, arrest me." Pretty cool stuff. I don't know if they're still around doing that, but that was a number of years ago. So the feds ban it across state lines. They say it's illegal to transport raw milk, but they also claim the authority to ban it within the borders of the state. Here's how they put it. It is within HHS's authority to institute an intrastate ban on unpasteurized milk as well. This is a total distortion of the Commerce Clause, claiming that they have power, of course, over anything and anything that might impact human activity. And that's how the FDA and the HHS treat raw milk. So the idea is, again, preemptive. The more that states legalize this, the harder it would be for the feds to actually institute not just the interstate, but the intrastate ban. And that's how Meharry puts it as well. When states allow the sale of raw milk within their borders, it takes an important step towards nullifying this federal prohibition scheme in practice and effect. A similar law expanding sales for raw milk went into effect in North Dakota. And then there's the Wyoming Food Freedom Act, which was the first kind of comprehensive Food Freedom Act passed in 2015. It allows the sale of many foods and food products direct from the producer to the consumer without following a whole bunch of onerous and expensive regulatory and licensing requirements. But there's this new law that went into effect on July 1st, Senate file or Senate Bill 102, that also adds specifically eggs and dairy products to these foods that can be sold directly from the producer to the consumer without any regulatory scheme getting in the way. The government's protecting us from ourselves. So they can be sold at farmers markets, farms, ranches, producers' homes, or offices, and the retail location of even third-party sellers. And Meharry makes an interesting point here about addressing not just some free choice in the regulatory state, but some of the harmful effects of the Federal Reserve monetary printing scheme, because it's making everything more expensive. And the more that you have more producers, the more that you can kind of reduce the impact of that. He says it much better than I do. Expanding the market for eggs and dairy could provide some relief for Wyoming residents struggling to deal with price inflation, not monetary inflation, but price inflation, which is the result of it. The price of both eggs and milk has increased precipitously over the last year, well, even longer than that. Opening up the market to more producers and sellers could help the people of Wyoming to get some relief from the money printing frenzy of recent years. I'd like to see this type of thing expanded to more and more products, more and more items, more and more businesses. The more that states take away kind of regulatory burdens, the more that it opens up the market, the more that the market is open. You can see, like, for example, with CBD, which is still illegal in most situations on a federal level, even though they legalized hemp in a farm bill a few years ago. But that's a side note. Anyways, here, now to the right to keep and bear arms, a little bit more here. Another piece of legislation that doesn't, it's an interesting one called the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act. I think the name isn't necessarily super accurate, but it certainly kind of tells people what they're trying to do. If you're making a transaction to purchase a firearm accessory, or ammunition, you shouldn't be surveilled. You shouldn't have your financial activity surveilled merely for making a purchase of a tool of self-defense. And in Idaho, is this Idaho? No, this is in Florida. Senate Bill 214, the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act, prohibits a payment settlement entity, a merchant acquiring entity, or a third-party settlement organization, credit card merchant processor, basically, from assigning a merchant category code or otherwise classifying a merchant that is a seller of firearms or ammunition separately from general merchandise retailers or sporting good retailers. Now, this was a program that was trying to be implemented by the major credit card processors. There's pressure from government officials, of course, to try to do this on a global scale as well. And what they're trying to do is be able to kind of segment who is making purchases. Now, of course, you can say, well, let's just use cash. But that really kind of impacts online retailers. It's a way to shut down business and really slows down business. Really, they just shouldn't be tracking what people do. And so this legislation in Florida takes a step against that type of program. And Idaho was actually the first one to do this. And they passed one into law, and it went into effect also on July 1st. And here from that report, Mike says, in response to legislation like House Bill 295 in Idaho and, of course, in Florida, and while these were all pending, none of them had been passed into law yet, 3 major credit card companies paused development. At least they paused it. They paused development of the firearms merchant code and implementation, but only because of these state bills. They specifically put out a statement that said, well, with all this legislation coming on a state-by-state level, we should hold off at least for now so we can see how this kind of pushback can have an impact very quickly. In an email to Reuters, a MasterCard representative said such bills would cause inconsistency in how the code could be applied by merchants, banks, and payment networks. The more states that ban such codes, the more likely this program gets scrapped altogether. I covered this in much more detail in an episode back in April while the bills were still under consideration. Nullification win, the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act, that will also be included in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But Idaho and Florida are not the only ones with Second Amendment Financial Privacy Acts going into effect. Those went into effect on July 1st. Montana and North Dakota have very similar ones that go into effect on August 1st, and Texas has one that goes into effect in September. So we're seeing a lot of movement on this. And again, I'd like to see this applied to more issues. But here's how Thomas Jefferson put it. So the states are supposed to be doing stuff that opposes federal programs that are either bad policy or unconstitutional. Unwarrantable acts or warrantable acts is how James Madison put it. So we've got Roger Sherman, we've got James Madison, even Alexander Hamilton. Now, of course, he generally complained about anyone wanting to oppose federal power, but maybe he slipped up there. And here's Thomas Jefferson. At the beginning of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, he pointed out that the several states are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. He was setting the foundation or reiterating a long-held foundation that the revolution was really something against unlimited submission to a total power. So they did not create a federal system, a constitution for these United States in order to have the same system once again. So there is a line in the sand. The line in the sand is the Constitution. As Jefferson put it, the 10th Amendment is the foundation of the Constitution. And ultimately, whether the states pass stuff like this or not, really ultimately it gets down to the people. If all the people comply with the stuff that they shouldn't be doing, with all the stuff that the government and their government partners want to kind of foist upon us, as long as people comply with everything, it doesn't matter if the states say, well, we're not going to force that because there's nothing to enforce. And that's how James Otis Jr. put it. He said, so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. And arbitrary measures are measures. Arbitrary power is one of the grievances or one of the usurpations listed in the Declaration of Independence. Power that does not have authority under the governing system, the Constitution for us, for the United States. Now, we covered all this in much more detail. We don't have the latest news in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report, but you can get a great overview. Well, it's not really an overview. It's like almost 300 pages, maybe 250 pages. The first half or so talks about the strategy of nullification and resistance like this, how it's been used throughout history, at least through our constitutional history. We didn't even go, we got a little Stamp Act stuff in there as well. But then we also talk about how it's being applied in practice today. We'll have an updated version of this. I know Mike Meharry is going to be working on that this summer, plus another book that I'll mention on Wednesday as well. But he'll be working on an update on our State of the Nullification Movement report to give you a 2023 update. Well, that goes out to members very quickly once we get it produced. But 10thamendmentcenter.com/report if you want to get more details of where things stand now. And of course, I will link to all these reports that I'm mentioning here in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Anyways, I'm running a little bit later than I need to today, or I was hoping for today, so I'm going to have to check into the comments a little bit later today or tomorrow. I generally, while I'm updating the website and getting everything posted to all the different platforms and sharing all the show links, I generally spend a little time over at Rumble, Odyssey, and YouTube after the show while I'm getting everything published for the next couple of hours. So if you've got some thoughts or comments that you want to share, I will definitely read those very quickly in the next couple of hours. But if not, I will look again over the next 24 or so before the next episode. Again, I really appreciate you being here. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, nothing helps us do that work every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I do want to take a quick moment while I'm here. I got to do it. I want to say thank you to a handful of people who joined us as members during the Independence Day week. I'm so grateful for your support. There's Julian in Washington, Chris in Kentucky, Greg in Virginia, maybe one or two before Independence Day, but around that time. Greg in Virginia, Deanna in Kentucky, Richard in Ohio, Alice in Vermont, and many others. Thank you so much. I'm extremely grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had a great weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.